Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate your engagement and feedback on this topic. I'm Lauren Hale, a Communications Assistant for Federated Farmers. Today we have with us National President and Climate Change Spokesperson for Federated Farmers, Andrew Hoggard. We have North Canterbury Farmer and Waka Eke Noa Steering Group Representative for Federated Farmers, Cameron Henderson. And finally, we have our Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Change, Macauley Jones, with us. So today we will have our speakers go through what's happening with Waka Eke Noa, where we're at, key issues, etc. And we will follow up with a Q&A session. And I'd ask everyone to put their questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to get to them as soon as we can. To kick things off, I'm going to hand it over to Mac to give a bit of an introduction to Waka Eke Noa and explain where the process is at. Over to you, Mac.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everyone for tuning in and giving up your time to hear us explain this at the start and to ask us questions. Yeah, really appreciate your time, and it's the feedback from you guys that we'll be using to take our steer going forward. So I'll push through as quickly as possible and setting the scene. There's a lot of information that we've put out, that a lot of other groups have put out, and that's available on the Waka Eke Noa website about this, but I'll just set the scene a little bit, and then Andrew and Cam will talk through the sort of issues and solutions, and then we'll get into questions, which is, I'm sure, is what you guys want to hear. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the big question we get a bit is to why are we doing this? Yep, next slide, brilliant. So that's one. The government was elected in 2017 to price ag emissions via the ETS. They were going down a road of doing it via the processor level. As industry, we got together and put forward an option that would be a preferable way of doing it, accepting the fact that ag emissions are going to be priced, and that became Waka Eke Noa. And you can see all the both the industry partners and MFE and MPI down below. If you go to the next slide, please. So it is quite a broad church in terms of participants and in terms of actions we're undertaking. So it involves farms planning, so having a farm environment plan that includes climate change. It includes farmers knowing their number. So if many of you have used either Overseer, FarmAx, the beef and lamb tool, that'll give you a number for that. So that's for awareness. You can't measure what you can't manage. So there's those first two areas of measurement and managing. And then the third one is what today's about, what the report's about. It's that first bullet point. It's been a bit of an extension giving there in light of COVID, but we've got to deliver a report to ministers and how we'd be happy for agricultural emissions to be priced. And this is where the rub hits the road when we're talking about your guys' money. If we go to the next slide, please. So we've come up with two broad options, as well as the government's backstop of ag in the ETS. So the government said if you guys don't come up with something that you all agree with and that we like, as well as the Climate Change Commission, we reserve the right to bring agriculture in the ETS. We didn't agree with that, but at the end of the day, they're the government and they've got the numbers. And that's kind of how this works. So the two numbers we're talking about today in particular, the farm level levy, and then the processor hybrid levy. This A plus B minus C comes up a bit. A is your short-lived emissions, so methane. B is your long-lived emissions, so nitrous oxide and a little bit of carbon dioxide from fertilizer. Minus C, which is your credit from your sequestration, and that'll be touched on more. So and that system broadly applies to both, but there are some key differences in how it's done. Go through to the next slide, please, Paul. So here's a diagram, and we'll you can take a screenshot of this if you're on your computer now, but I'll quickly sort of just go through some of the key points to it. And this visually just describes how the two systems achieve or intended to achieve broadly the same goals, but just going through it and achieving those goals in a different way. So the A plus B minus C system for the farm level levy, that applies on your on-farm emissions, which is more accurate, which recognises that different amounts of meat and milk can be produced more efficiently, that fertilizer can be used more efficiently. But the downside of this system is that it is more expensive. We've got subject matter experts to estimate the administration costs. As you look into the hood of those administration costs, some farmers think they can do it cheaper. That's something we'll discuss later on. But you're talking millions of dollars to set that up. So the processor hybrid, that's the intention behind that is to take the best bits of the farm level levy and the affordability of ag and the ETS and merge them together. So that involves your emissions efficiency isn't recognised, so you're being charged per kilo of meat and milk, which isn't great, but it's not bringing ag into the ETS. The methane and nitrous oxide are being set at a different price. That we'll touch on later on. That price is being determined by a committee. And then that money will be used broadly to achieve the same goals, which is sequestration, R&D, and incentivising behaviour change that we want to see, the use of mitigation tools and the improvement of practices. It's just different means of achieving that same end. Each system has upsides and downsides. If we go to the next slide, please, Paul. So this is just as well as being just very artistic from myself here, this is just a visual sort of run through of how it stacks up with our policy. As you see, the long-lived and short both options distinguish between long and short-lived emissions, both your Waka Eke Noa options, that is, and bringing ag into the ETS doesn't. It would use that GWP 100 metric that I'm sure you've heard Andrew talk about before, and that's as far as we're seeing it, that's the main upside of these two options. Using price exclusively to incentivize cost-effective mitigation tools, that's something that the options don't do so far. There will be a price if you are using all the options you can, and the other one is that a price shouldn't put New Zealand farmers at a competitive disadvantage. And due to the lack of certainty around price and the fact that no other country, no other exporting nation is talking about pricing agricultural emissions to the extent talked about here, that it doesn't meet our criteria for that though. So that's something that as our National Council will discuss this, they'll be considering and seeing how this weighs up. Are those wins in the short-lived, distinguishing between short and long-lived emissions sufficient for federated farmers, and can those other areas be improved on as we go forward through Waka Eke Noa? And that's the core challenge we have as an organisation. It's a challenge and an opportunity to go forward, but it's everything's on the table as we sit now, and we've done our best over the past 2 years to shape this, and then we're just keen to hear from you guys as to whether this is good enough to go forward. And I'll now pass it over to Andrew, and I think Andrew and Cam will just go through some of the issues we have, and then some of the possible solutions to those issues as well. So if we go to the next slide, please. There we go.
All right, thank you. So what I'm going to cover here is some of the key sort of concerns that we've spotted or feel about the proposals at the moment. These are the two HEWEN proposals, and I guess some ideas that we've been batting around as to what could be remedies for them. How could we make them better? And I guess what we're after is feedback from our membership farmers as to, is this working? Does it work for you? Are we on the right track? Do we need to do more, or should we not even be bothering with it? So I guess as Mac sort of mentioned, the first one, it's around the price setting. At the moment, any sort of prices you've seen have all been based off the ETS backstop. We don't actually know what the precise dollar amount will be under either of the two Waka proposals. And the other thing we don't know is how will the price be set. As Cam mentioned, there's going to be some sort of committee, and who's going to be on it? How are they going to be selected? These, at the moment, this is still up in the air, and we don't know what that's going to be. It could well be, mates of the government, and that would be rather concerning. And so I guess some of the thoughts we've had, number one is putting a price ceiling in there, so that basically if either of those two options are selected, neither of them would end up charging you more than what you would currently pay under the ETS backstop. The other thing is, before we sign up to anything, we'd be wanting to know, what are the factors that are going to be considered. That's actually in the document. We and the government are absolutely crystal clear on what issues are going to be considered. Is it going to be that it's sole focus on reducing emissions to the government's targets, or factors like, consistent with the Paris Accord in terms of not reducing food production and emissions leakage and harming the New Zealand economy. So that would be a key thing we believe that in any sort of document needs to be clearly outlined. Now, the other point would be the representation on this committee. I think it's important that the industry, in terms of all those logos you saw, all the agricultural bodies on that, make it absolutely clear to the government that, we are going to have a good chunk of us on this committee, or, we will select some people that go on this committee, that it's not all going to be ministerial appointments. I mean, yeah, it may be that the minister ticks, but we give him the list of names that he's allowed to tick from. That would be an important point. And I guess the other thing would be that, there's further iterations on the farm level in particular that you could put in, like the output rebate. There was the split, the cap and trade approach that would take some of the uncertainty to a degree away from the price. So those are some of the ideas we've had in that area. The next point was the revenue recycling decisions. So one of the concerns, of course, would be, and I guess we all see it every day with, how our money gets spent on various things, be it, government level or local council level, and some of the ridiculous stuff our money gets frittered away on. And there'd be a real concern of, if there's people on these committees that potentially they're conflicted with being, where the money might be going to. Will they be voting for lots of money for their own organisations? And also, will it be about a whole bunch of political pet projects? So you can imagine if the minister put some favourites of his on there, there might be some of the, wanting to push a whole bunch of stuff on regenerative agriculture or other pet sort of projects that certain people want to spout on about, rather than being directed into what's actually needed. So I guess some of the key things we've thought about are that actually, if you're on the price setting committee, or if you help set the price, then you're not, or your organisation isn't on the revenue recycling committee. And yeah, to try and keep that separate to reduce any conflict of interest. And also, we need to be real clear on what that revenue is going to be spent on. So we've already got, as you may well know, what they call the Pastoral Greenhouse Gas Research Consortium. Now it's getting a whole bunch of industry levy money at the moment, looking into agricultural emissions reductions. So is it one of the solutions to be saying, right, here's X amount of this will automatically go into this committee that's already doing this work? I feel like they're reasonably well sort of focused on the science and not wrapped up in politics, and also clearly outlining that actually some of it, we'll get to it further, but one of the issues is the admin. So perhaps some of that revenue recycling is dedicated to improving data interoperability, making those sort of systems much better, and also coming up with new technology that makes the whole collection of the data much more easier and clearer. So that's some of the thoughts we've had there. Now with sequestration, one of the problems we've seen is, so there's the issue that a lot of people have that it's possibly not going to account for all of the sequestration on their farms due to timelines. But a bigger problem we've seen is that all of the sequestration that's going to be accounted for, basically it's the money raised from farmers is going to pay for that. Now, at the moment, they're including allowing ETS eligible native forestry to be included under Waka. Now, that payment has to come from farmers. We sort of feel actually that needs to go into the actual ETS, and ideally what would be best is if we can put as much as possible of the sequestration into the ETS would be the ideal outcome. That way, rather than farmers having to pay for it, it's the likes of Air New Zealand and all these other companies that are buying up hill country farms to plant trees. We're providing a bit more of a supply in the carbon market for them to keep that hopefully price down, and they're the ones bringing money in. The risk is certainly that, you know, if we can do a really good job and prove that there's all this amount of sequestration out there and we're sequestering a lot more carbon than what we're allowed to, and as we keep on improving it, if it all has to be paid through by the farmer levies, then effectively we're going to have to up those levies. We're not going to have as much to spend on research and data interoperability and things like that. It's all going to go back into a bit of a circle with going back into the sequestration. Then people look at it and go, well, I don't really, how can I reduce this amount I'm paying? Actually, I'll decrease my stock numbers a bit more. I'll put some more into trees. And then suddenly there's more sequestration that has to be paid for, but it's spread over less gases. And so then you have to lift the price even again up more. And it gets into a very vicious circle. So for us, I hope I've explained that well enough that people can understand, but for us, the key thing is if it's ETS eligible, it needs to be in the ETS, or we could, if we can do the recording through Waka, but make the payment through the ETS would be the way, or ensure that the, you know, it's important that some of the revenue recycling is funding projects to look into more ways to validate the types and ages of sequestration. And then just, yeah, if we can create the validation within Waka and then move it over to the ETS. So there's a couple of sort of ideas there where we're trying to shift the burden off from farmers into that fuller carbon market, because I just think there's a real risk that we could create a problem for ourselves if we allow it to sort of sit how it is at the moment. Next slide, please. And yeah, the fourth one I sort of wanted to touch on the admin costs. So as I mentioned before, you know, as you see in the farm level levy, which, you know, seems to be the preferred amongst most farmers that I've talked to, although if we've got to, yeah, accepting there's a lot of people going, why are we doing any of this? But, you know, most people, if you had to pick one or two, they'd rather the farm level, but it has these very high admin costs. And so, as I mentioned before, the revenue recycling, actually, let's put it into projects that are going on, such as the data interoperability, to make this system simple as possible, that it minimizes those costs for farmers, and there will also be the sort of co-benefit of the fact that we're probably going to need to be doing all this stuff for all the water regulations as well. We're kind of having to do a lot of it already for other regulations. So if we can invest in smarter tools, it's going to make our lives easier. And, you know, if you've got smart information coming back to you, it can help you make smarter farming decisions, which might actually be reasonable for the bottom line. So that's one key change we'd like to see with those admin costs, is making sure some of that revenue recycling does get directed into those sort of projects. Now those, they kind of really apply, those four I've mentioned sort of apply mainly to the farm level, partly for some of them to the hybrid as well. But yeah, I'll pass over to Cam now to talk about the last three.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So moving on with number 5, the recognition of early adopters. So this carries on the conversation around revenue recycling. So revenue, as Andrew said, revenue recycling is really about how do we use the funds generated to kind of incentivize certain actions. And the discussion at the moment within the steering group is that there's kind of two options. There's one based on what they call benchmarking, So basically you pick a point in time, and the engagement document talks about being 2017, and that we use the money to incentivize actions that are taken after that date. So if you were, say, using a lot of fertilizer back in 2017, and you, after that point, reduce your fertilizer usage, that you should get some reward for doing that, because it's a good action for climate change. Or it might be genetics, or it might be planting trees, or whatever it might be that's reducing emissions. The other option is that it's action-based. So basically, if you are doing a certain thing, it doesn't matter when you've done it from, you get the incentive or the payment for that particular action. So it might be, for example, the fertilizer thing. If you're using less than a certain amount per hectare or per crop, or whatever it might be, doesn't matter when you started doing it. Could have been today, yesterday, 10 years ago. You might even start doing it tomorrow. You know, that you get the payment as soon as you are seen to have done that action. So I guess the pros and cons are with a benchmark type approach. So going back to that 2017 example, only those farmers that take up the action after that date get any incentive to do it. So if you've been running a really efficient system for a number of years prior to 2017, or have done a lot of planting, or run a really low fertilizer program, because you've been doing it for a while, before that start date, that benchmark date, you wouldn't get any reward at all. But the person who starts doing it today would get that reward. So we see that there's a level of unfairness in that essentially those early adopters, the ones that are doing a great job and have been doing it for a long time, don't get the same rewards as those that are a little bit slower to pick up those actions. So what we are really pushing for is an action-based revenue recycling. So, and that could be as simple as a list of a whole lot of actions. You go through and tick all the things that you are doing. So long as you can prove you can do it, then you get the reward for that. And it doesn't matter when you started doing it. If you're doing it, you get the payment, which helps offset some of your pricing. So it's one of the key design features that I think introduces a lot more fairness, or we think introduces a lot more fairness to the system. So number 6, international competitiveness and avoiding emissions leakage. Now this is a really key aspect in that essentially we don't want New Zealand to reduce its emissions, but in doing so actually dramatically increase global emissions, because what we're producing is being produced somewhere else, but just less efficiently. And when it comes, everyone knows how efficient we are at producing, particularly meat and milk. Generally, if that same product, if we're not producing it, someone else will, and they probably will emit more emissions doing it. So ultimately, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot as a global community if we're reducing national emissions only to increase proportionally global emissions. So we feel, Feds feel that the emissions leakage needs to be one of the key criteria in setting prices. That we either put a cap on the amount of leakage that we're seeing, or ideally no leakage at all, but that at least in the price setting mechanism that we talked about earlier, that emissions leakage is seen as one of the key criteria, that we're not putting national targets ahead of international targets, the Paris Climate Change Accord targets, which is looking at a global outcome rather than just a national outcome. And then number 7, which I think is probably covering a lot of the discussion around He Waka Eke Noa, and that is, how does He Waka fit in with the government's emissions targets, which we definitely do not agree with. So how can we agree to a He Waka Eke Noa when we don't agree with the government's emissions targets? And the approach that we've taken, and that many of the partners are taking, is that to keep the two policy areas separate. Now, I know that seems like quite an odd thing to do, because they are very, very closely related. But arguably, if we brought emissions targets into He Waka Eke Noa, it really has not a hope in hell of getting agreement, not only from us, but from a number of partners, because there is no agreement amongst those partners on what those emissions targets should be. And there wouldn't be. We could sit in that room for many months and we would never come to an agreement as a group on what those targets should be. So as I say, the plan from the very beginning, the agreement has been that we keep the two agreements separate, that in agreeing to a He Waka Eke Noa option is not agreeing to the government's emissions targets. And so I guess the feedback that we'd like is that should we be continuing to push for that model, so 2 different discussions, or should the emissions targets be a condition for federated farmers to be continuing to support He Waka Eke Noa? I guess the potential downside is that if we decide not to support He Waka Eke Noa because we don't agree with the emissions targets, and potentially other partners do likewise, that He Waka Eke Noa falls over and we end up in the ETS by the end of the year and the emissions targets don't change anyway. So we might be able to stand on our high horse and say we've done the right thing in pushing for better targets, but ultimately agriculture ends up in a worse place. So as much as we would love to be able to bring that discussion in and seek agreement on all of it, so that we're agreeing to an entire package of both targets and pricing that we can live with, we just can't get there. And I guess if we try and push that too hard, the risk is that we end up in a worse position than what we might do otherwise. It's a very tough decision that we've wrestled with ongoing, and yeah, really keen to hear some feedback on what you guys think on that issue. So I think is that next slide, is that the end of our key issues, I believe. Yep, so we'll hand back to, I think, is it Andrew for what's next?
Yeah, so sort of following on from what Cam was talking about there, we've got some real tricky discussions coming up. We're having a meeting of our National Council on 2nd of March. It was going to be face-to-face, but now it's all going to be Zoom, unfortunately. Sort of decide where we go from here. There'll be a member advisory, survey for member feedback, starting on the 15th of February, just to get our feedback in front of that time. And so really there's, I guess, yeah, sort of following on from what Cam said, a lot of political ramifications and pros and cons of what sort of position we take. I mean, if our membership is solid and our provinces are like we're saying no, that's cool, we'll say no. But I sort of want everyone to understand that, you know, saying no does mean the ETS. That is a reality. The government will chuck us in there. We can all pack up our tents and head down to join the mob down in Parliament if we want, but I'm not sure that's going to change a lot. You know, given the numbers the government have, they will force that through. Now, is the ETS as it stands at the moment? Yeah, it would be a worse outcome than either of the two presented. However, the ETS changes every year effectively. There's always new legislation. Government's talked about changing things. So yes, there is always the possibility that they may change the ETS and make it more workable. Who knows? Given, you know, if you look ahead to the next election on current poll numbers, it won't be a Labor majority government. It could be a Labor Greens government. Would that be, we could be potentially in a worse position, or it may be a National Act government. At this stage, it's, you know, it's a bit of a coin toss. And so that is the risk. Of course, if we say yes and we go with it, whilst we've got a whole range of sort of things that, you know, details that we're uncertain of at the moment, like we've mentioned with the price, with the governance, issues around the sequestration, then we've kind of given consent, and we've given away to a degree our ability to argue with a degree of authority against some of these aspects. And so that then becomes a real risk, and it makes it very unlikely that any incoming government, so if there was a National Act government coming in, makes it very unlikely that they would change if the entire ag sector were to have agreed to these two options, if we weren't particularly happy with them in the end. But then you've got to also think about the fact previous national governments haven't had a great track record in turning back previous Labor Party or government initiatives. Just think of what was it, the no smacking, the student-free loans, working with families, all sort of stuff that they sort of said or spoke against, and then the John Key government didn't do anything about. So there is quite some risks, quite a lot of risks. And I know there's a lot of people just want to say, just thump your fist and make it go away. I wish I could do that, but the reality is that it's going to have, some implications. And, I just, my key thing is everyone to be really informed about what it is that we're facing here, and just make informed decision. If we want to, and if it is that everyone wants to send a clear signal and say, no, this isn't good enough to support at this moment, then fine. Like Max said, and I don't know if many of you have read the sort of thought piece Macauley had put together in our member advisory the previous week. We want to support a Waka Eke Noa option that stands on its own feet, not just that it's less worse than the ETS. So we've got some ideas here on how we could make it, better and functional, and not just a less worse, but certainly keen on taking your feedback and your views on that. And like I say, there'll be a survey, and we will be, putting some, coalescing these thoughts and ideas around how we can improve it more. And so getting that out to you and seeking your feedback. So look, I'll stop talking and open up to Q&A.
Cool, thanks, Andrew. So we did have some members submit some questions prior to the webinar, so they get to jump the queue. I'll ask them first. The first one I think has been covered off slightly with administration costs and everything. It's got the farm level assessment option has been quoted as costing huge amounts of money. What is the veracity of these costs?
Mac or Cam, you've been over the papers. Do you want to cover that?
Jump in on that one. Yeah, so we got some early numbers late last year around some modelling for why those costs were so high. And to give you an example, I think there was two reporting models for emissions that were being looked at, an intermediate version and a really advanced version. So basically, those are just the level of detail you need to go to get to get your emissions numbers. The detailed version of the reporting that farmers would need to do, they did some modelling with sheep and beef farmer to say it would actually take them 2 full weeks, so 80 hours. I think it might have been more than that. It might have been 100 hours to actually complete the reporting for the detailed emissions report. And I don't know about you, but I don't know anything else that takes me 2 weeks to fill in from a reporting perspective on emissions. Even my overseer report only takes a few hours. So I mean, we pushed back on that and said, look, that seems a little ridiculous. Even the dairy farmer and arable numbers seemed very, very high. Yeah, so there's multiple opinions on that as to how accurate it is. It was based on survey work. Like all the modelling we've seen, we don't feel any of it's 100% accurate. Like all models, they're all wrong. Some are useful. This one is, as I feel, and I think we all feel, has overestimated the cost of that admin. But what I think people probably need to understand, and this is not just like reporting your, doing an overseer report or reporting on how much fertilizer you're using. You need to be able to prove everything you put into this report. So that includes being able to, like if you've got stock numbers, you need to be able to have some sort of administration system that proves you had these numbers on these dates, or that you use so much fertilizer at certain times of the year. So it's that proving of it. So it might be weighing stock, it might be the fact that you've bought baleage in, and instead of just counting the number of bales, actually to get it fully accurate from an emissions perspective, you may need to weigh all those bales as they come in. You may need to test the quality of those bales potentially. So there's all the added cost to getting to that level of accuracy, if that's the way we want to go, in the farm level administration, versus just taking a broad average across all farms, which is where the hybrid system is so much cheaper. So that's the level of scrutiny when you put pricing on something like this, just adds to the level of auditing and proof that you need to provide, and that's largely where the cost is coming in. But yeah, broadly, we think it's going to be a lot cheaper than what they're modelling.
Awesome. The next one. Stock must be excluded from native bush established pre-1st of January 2008 for this bush to be used as carbon sequestration. Why is this, and is this set in stone?
I could probably take that one if we like. So this comes from a tension in a lot of climate change policy and including sequestration, is the tension between accounting and practicality, really. And this is one where there's an additionality principle, which from an accounting point of view makes sense. We want every ton of carbon counted to be a new ton of carbon. So this has the benefits of ensuring that if you're using that ton of carbon to offset against emissions, it's all real, right? It's not just numbers on a page. The downside of that is, of course, that if you've already integrated a lot of sequestration into your farm, a little bit similar to what Cam was talking about with some of the EMC stuff, you're put in a disadvantage to someone who hasn't got those sequestration on their farm and can get paid to put it in. So the 2008 or the stock exclusion with having early native vegetation, that comes from a need to show additionality, and the additionality is not necessarily from the trees themselves or the vegetation themselves if it's mature, but it's the improved management practice. So it's you doing something that wouldn't otherwise occur, which will add to the carbon stocks in that plot of land, I guess, for lack of a better term. So that includes pest control. So if there's fewer possums, the trees will be in healthier condition and contain more carbon. And if you include exclude stock from the vegetation, likewise, the forest can regenerate and recover, and there'll be more carbon. So the sequestration working group, brought in some ecologists to get those numbers and to set the requirements. I think as it stands now, it's excluding stock, so it's not necessarily fencing. It can be other barriers. And as to whether it's set in stone, from our point of view, none of this is set in stone, right? That's where it stands now. If we get overwhelming feedback on a point, we'll push for that point, and likewise with other partners, and that's where that's coming from. And I think, the practicalities of excluding stock from scattered native patches isn't, it's not practical in all areas. And the big thing for sequestration is no one has to do any of this. This is all optional, but there are, as you go through that list, we've got a lot of feedback, and we certainly felt this as we're going through. It is quite stringent feedback, and there were a lot of compromises to satisfy the accountancy side of it from a government point of view, and that's just a product of that broad church of partners that we're dealing with.
Oh, sorry about that little hiccup in our slideshow. The next one we've got is, while supportive of options 1 and 2, I am concerned about their high administration costs. It would be useful to be able to compare these costs with the potential benefits to farmers. What is the value of assumed research funding and the national totals of EMC and SMC credits?
You want to cover that one? You're over that more than I am.
There's a lot of maths. I actually can't, record it off the top of my head. I'd have to refer back to the engagement document for some of those numbers. But probably just the point of the admin costs. I talked a little bit before about why some of that is so high, and it's an option. We haven't talked about it in this presentation, but the engagement document hints at the ability to potentially start with one option with the hybrid and move to farm level over time. And the reason for that is that if you could start with the cheaper option that just ticks the box, gets us away from the ETS into the hybrid system, the cheap option, that yes, it's got its flaws, but it could buy us time and the ability to use some of that revenue recycling from hybrid to make the admin for a farm level option, which I think everyone kind of agrees is the better option long term, a lot cheaper. And that, Andrew talked about it before, putting money into better IT systems so that our minder can talk to our farm IQ, that can talk to our overseer, so that we're not double data entering, that all that data can kind of be sucked up automatically and just dramatically reduces the amount of time that we have to do in reporting it, which cuts the cost down and would make farm level a lot more appropriate over time. So that's the challenge. I think I can't remember who talked about it earlier, but the we've got a limited amount of revenue that we're going to be able to use to deliver on some of these systems, and that's one of the tensions we've got, is that yes, the more we pay for farmer sequestration, the less we've got to be able to pay for these other technological advances, the less we've got to be able to pay for R&D, into engagement, into everything else that's supporting farmers into the system. So that's a challenge. We're going to have a limited amount of money. It's still going to be a big pot of money, but a limited pot of money to be able to deliver on some of these things. And particularly the tension we've got at the moment is around that price of sequestration, that if we pay ETS level value for that sequestration, it could gobble up upwards of half or more of all the revenue that's collected. And so we've got a lot less available to actually help agriculture get to, to develop this technology and streamline the process, really. So I hope that helps whoever asked that question.
The next one we have is, can the future Waka panel or the Climate Change Commission increase the tax even more to encourage a change in behaviour? For example, 16 cents per kilogram of milk solid is not much for a dairy farmer when their milk solid price can easily change by $1 between seasons.
That's something, we don't know at this stage, and that's some of the concern we've got, like I mentioned, with the governance and who's on that committee, around what the prices could be. And, that's something we want a lot more clarity on before we'd be willing to even consider to sign up for all of this, is having that clarity around what could be done there. Like I said, we wanted to put in a price cap. That was one of our suggestions. At this stage, the other parties aren't particularly interested in that. Cam or Mac, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, just to add to that too, that lack of certainty around the price cuts across many areas. So the answer to your question is there's nothing stopping them as now. There is criteria that is quite good, those four points of criteria, but they are very high level. And it's also hard to talk about a cost benefit analysis with the administration costs when the prices in the document are pegged to the ETS and they're just placeholders. There's no real decision made, and it could be an order of magnitude higher or lower. And I think that's a tough conversation to have between the broad church of members, but that's a conversation that needs to happen eventually. And I think maybe as a partnership we've been putting that off. So that I think once we get some certainty around the price, one way or another, other issues become a lot clearer as well. So that's there's as it stands now, there's a lot of uncertainty about what this is actually going to cost, by who, under what conditions, what's our involvement, and that cuts across a lot of issues.
So the next one we've got is, farmers have been contributing through the ETS as consumers of fuel and electricity levies. Why is that not being acknowledged?
I would say every time I've been on the media interview on this and they go, farmers aren't part of the ETS, I've always pointed out, yes, we are part of the ETS like everyone else in New Zealand. We're paying for our fuel, we're paying for our energy. We're big users of both because we live out in the boonies and we've got lots of things on farm that require energy to make them work. So we're in the same game with everyone else in New Zealand in that regard. I guess, that's what we're talking about here is something different. It's the biological emissions. The challenge I see with the biological emissions is getting people to understand the difference with them, particularly methane, the short-lived nature of it, the fact that we don't have to go to zero, and also the fact that the emissions leakage argument, which we've covered, and so it was actually pleasing. I don't know how many saw it, the poll on News Hub the other night, that the majority of people polled felt that we shouldn't be reducing herd numbers to meet climate change targets. So I was kind of happy and pleased to see that result. It kind of made me feel like, hey, maybe someone is listening to the stuff I say. So yeah, I guess that's the response. I know it doesn't quite answer the question, but I think that's about probably the only response I could give.
I have a feeling I know what the answer to this one will be. Wouldn't it simply be better to charge a simple levy and to spend it all on research and development and to help developing countries farm better? Wouldn't this be better for the global atmosphere rather than building this large system in New Zealand?
Yes.
Yes.
Simple answer, yes.
Yes.
If the government understood
Yes.
that, we'd all be better off, but unfortunately, they don't.
The political reality is we're probably not going to be allowed to push that, but we might give it a try. I mean, Macaulay's got a bit of a proposal idea there around exactly that. We can certainly give it a crack, but yeah, just knowing the discussions I've been in before, we'll just get told to go away. But we can always give it a crack.
Awesome. And this has come up as a frequently asked question in some of our previous engagements is, can products like wool and sheep milk be included in the pricing system at a later stage, and also inclusion of animals like goats and horses? That's come up a few times.
Mac, do you want to cover off the details around what's eligible and what isn't?
Yeah, so in terms of pricing emissions, there's a cutoff that I think it's a certain number of livestock, or the selling of those livestock being your main source of income. The exact details I don't know at the top of my head, but they're in that document. And the reason for that is that captures, I think, about 25,000 farms, and it captures, I think, 96% of agricultural emissions using that GWP 100 approach. So as we expand out into goats, into horses and other areas, the administration costs, which are already extremely large, go up exponentially, and the returns to get that 4% go down exponentially as well. So we had to draw a line somewhere. We don't want to go around accounting for every lifestyle block owner's horse and have someone in an MPI uniform giving them a bill for their emissions. That's silly. So we have to draw a line somewhere, and we've done that in the document so far, I think.
And I'd hate to be the MPI official that tried to give my 12-year-old a bill for her horse.
Okay, so we've got, if the ability to claim emissions reduction and sequestration rebates is the same with farm level calculations and processor level hybrid levy, EMC and SMC, is the only real difference between the two systems the fact that the hybrid system penalises farms that have more efficient livestock production per kilogram of methane emissions?
I would say the hybrid, the difference there is it's not 100% accurate to your farm. Cam, did you want to add any extra to that?
Yeah, so it comes down to accuracy versus cost. So the more we've talked about revenue recycling, the more, as they say, looking very similar between the two options. There's still some debate around, I talked about before, whether we use benchmarks or actions. They're arguably probably going to be very similar for both models. They've got different names, but arguably the same thing. So you're right, it's really down to the pricing mechanism of, do we want something that's accurate but more expensive, or something that's cheaper but uses a lot of averages? And so those farms, as the question asks, if you are inherently more efficient, then you are going to be subsidising those that are less efficient in hybrid level.
Okay. Could we make ETS inclusion of carbon sequestration from currently non-ETS eligible vegetation part of our final Waka proposal? As Andrew said, we might need to invest Haywen funds into the development of a validated recording system.
Yeah, well, certainly that's what I'd like, some of that revenue recycling to be directed towards that sequestration, and trying to make sure we can validate every type of sequestration that we know is going on. And, some of it will need a lot more science work behind it and research around, what is, particularly with regenerating native bush, there'll need to be case studies and work like that. But if we can validate it, then there is no reason. I think it would be a good outcome that, Hey Waka is the place where we trial these ideas, that we can validate it, prove it, and then shift that over to the ETS, because then it certainly helps with the fact that it, reduces the cost on farmers with needing to cover that cost of paying for the sequestration, and we put it into the pool of everyone else that wants to do offsetting, which keeps that carbon price down. Well, it'll help, it'll dampen it a little bit, although it seems to be going away at quite a rate of knots. But certainly if we didn't, the risk is you actually set up a perverse incentive by allowing ETS eligible stuff to be under HEWEN. Then people would go, well, actually, if I put it into Hey Waka and I keep it out of the ETS, that reduces supply there, pushes the price up. And if it's linked between the two, then yay, I'm on a winner. That's great for them, but not great for the rest of us. So yeah, that I agree with that question. So it's a long way of saying it.
Can I just add to that? So one of the challenges with the ETS is that the standards for what's included in the ETS as far as sequestration is based on international standards for carbon accounting, rightly or wrongly. But that's the basis of what it is at the moment. And so our challenge with trying to push sub-ETS sequestration into the ETS is this this barrier of, well, it's not considered internationally in global carbon accounting. And so the solution to that, as Andrew said, is if we can build a system that closely mimics ETS to the point where, ultimately, if we can get recognition in the ETS, that basically we've got the system set up that we can just swap it into the ETS as soon as possible, and all that the sequestration side is dealt with in a larger carbon market. So yeah, failing being able to get it into the ETS straight away, I think at least need to build something that could be easily transitioned to ETS once we break down those barriers around those international definitions.
Yeah, and it's also probably a thing we need to be advocating for with our government, to be taking to some of these climate change conferences, that they're actually pushing for changes, because if we've got solid science that supports it, there's nothing, so long as other countries don't disagree, then it can be counted. We've just got to ask the question, which has been a bit of a challenge, as we found out with this year or last year, trying to get them to ask the question around split gas approach internationally. They didn't want to even go there.
Next question. If you reduced stocking rate by, say, 10% since 2017, what would be the reward for early action? Would it simply be a reduced carbon charge based on the lower stocking rate, so being an early adopter won't have any effect?
Good question. So the design, I can only sort of speak hypothetically because we don't have a firm design around what would actually get paid and at what levels. But ultimately, if you were, say, a really high, I'm going to pick a dairy farm because it's what I know best, but if you're a really high stocked dairy farm at the benchmark date 2017, you cut back on your stock numbers, so you're bringing in less feed, you're maybe using less fertilizer, so your emissions are dropping. That yes, you would receive a lower price because obviously you're emitting less, but you might also receive some of that revenue recycling money. So there's almost a double whammy there because you've taken an action of reducing your stocking rate or whatever it might be. So you not only face a lower price, but you also get more potentially revenue recycling because it's a recognised action that we're trying to incentivize. And the challenge is that if you end up at a certain stocking rate, say 2.5, you've come down from 4 down to 2.5, say, that a farm that's always been at 2.5 from before that period all the way through, yes, they face the lower pricing the whole way through, but they're not eligible for any of that revenue recycling. So we see that earlier farmer that's been running a lower stocking rate, running a really efficient system earlier, shouldn't necessarily be disadvantaged or should be receiving the same payment because they're essentially ending up at the same point. Why would you be disadvantaged for having just taken that action a lot earlier?
Okay, the next one. How does the 95% discount in ETS pricing work or not work?
Yeah, so this is the free allocation it came in with the coalition government back in 2017, where they made the announcement that they were going to bring, agriculture was already in the ETS, or agricultural gases were, but we were at 100% free allocation at that point. And the decision was, as part of the coalition agreement, that would be reduced down to 95% free allocation. So effectively what that would mean is, so if that was the case, they would calculate your farm's emissions using the GWP 100, so not split gas, and basically they'd ignore 95% of those emissions. They'd only look at 5% of them, times them by the current ETS price, and that's the bill you face. Now, the other part of that is that once it starts, it would be reducing at 1% per year. So the next year it'd be a 94% allocation going forward, increasing every year. That's effectively how it would work. And so I think I worked out the other day for my place, it was something like a $60 per hectare bill under that ETS. I think somewhere like the current prices, I think possibly $30,000 per year is what it would cost me. I think those numbers, yeah, I may not be 100% accurate there. I do remember crunching those numbers, but yeah, not something I want to be spending. Cam or Mac, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so agriculture is not the only industry that has free allocation. That comes up often, that we seem to be the only ones getting a discount. We're not. Cement, construction, there's a lot of big New Zealand producers that have free allocation, and the design of it is essentially to try and protect us from, if we had to pay our full price, it suddenly makes us really uncompetitive in the international market. And that's true for a number of products that New Zealand produces. So the free allocation is to, essentially, the idea is that we are given time to adjust our processes so that we reduce our emissions and become more competitive once the price and the allocation start to disappear. So firstly, agriculture is not the only one getting free allocation. And probably the second point is that the free allocation is really political. That we've saw, so originally we were only going to get 90% free allocation. New Zealand first got that up to 95, but there's nothing to say that that would drop away really quickly if the politics of the day said that they wanted to reduce our allocation. So Andrew talked about at the moment in law, it's going to drop away at 1% a year. Other industries are actually seeing it drop away faster than that. And all it would take is a quick political shift to suddenly see our discount disappear pretty quickly. So when Andrew gave some numbers for his farm, I farm 700 cows. If I was paying full price, even at the current carbon charge for my emissions, I'd be up for a $279,000 bill every year. So that's how important that free allocation is. It drops your bill from over $250,000 down to about $30,000 or $40,000 a year. But you might start at 30 or 40, but if the politics go against you, it could ramp up pretty quick. So that's one of the reasons why we really want to stay out of the ETS, because hopefully it removes that ability for the politicians of the day to pull on that lever and whip that free allocation out from underneath us.
Okay, I'll just say quickly, we're about to reach the 1 p.m. point. For those that need to go, we are recording this session and it will be made available as soon as possible. We will continue on with questions and answers at the moment for a bit longer, as we still have some questions in the Q&A box. Just a reminder for those of you that do need to go, we now have the Fed's Voice app, which you can find and download on the Play Store for Android or on the Apple Store for iPads and iPhones, etc. So if you just Google Fed's Voice, it should come up. If not, please let me know, or please contact someone here and we'll try and get those links to you. So basically you go into the app and create a ID, login, everything, and you can go in and access podcasts, news items, and you'll see that there's an option to record questions on Hey Waka Eke Noa, and we will try to get to those as soon as possible. Awesome. So for those of you that do have to leave, thanks for joining us, and we'll continue on with the questions and answers for a bit longer. The next one we have, which is an interesting one, with the improvements you are suggesting now to members, what was the response from the Haywen collaboration group when you submitted these to them?
So not all of them have been submitted. Some of them we actually came up with last weekend, and we're sort of batting them around and getting feedback. I think of the stuff we have tried to push forward, so the price ceiling, Cam can speak to that, but at this stage we haven't had a great deal of success there. And some of the other, so we, in those ideas, we'd mentioned the output rebate as a way of minimizing emissions leakage. That, you know, there was only one other party, Dairy Companies Association, that was in favor of that. All the others weren't. Mac, are there any other items there that we've, or Cam, the ones that we've, ideas and that we've put forward, to how they've gone?
Just the sequestration stuff. I'm pushing action-based and having it be regardless of whether you're undertaking that behaviour starting tomorrow or you've been doing it for a while. That's got a better pushback because they want to incentivize change. You know, we don't want to pay farmers for what they're already doing, is the attitude of you know, of some partners, and that's, you know, that's probably a bit of an ideological difference, is that, you know, if you're doing the right thing, you're doing the right thing, versus we need to make change and hit targets. Yeah, that output-based option that Andrew talked about, so that would have operated. We talked about these in the last seminars, but that would have operated very similar to the free allocation regime that works on efficiency. That didn't get a lot of support either from government or from other industry partners. That's because of you know, a risk, you know, its impact, both its complexity and its some of the more, yeah, the other possible impacts from it. Sequestration stuff. There's been a lot of pushback on that tension between accounting and practicality, I'd say, and that's, again, comes to how you view this. So anything else you can think of, Cam?
Yeah, look, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I liked the price ceiling. Actually, most of the partners, apart from the government, really like the idea. The government's the one pushing back on that, and others, like, as Andrew said, with output based, we've got agricultural partners that don't see the value in it. So, I mean, it is one of the challenges when you've got so many people sitting around the table to try and get agreement from all angles is very, very difficult. Beef and lamb very much want ETS level pricing for sequestration, which, God, I wish we could offer that, but it's just difficult to promise that. So it's not necessarily to say that none of this stuff is going to happen. Some of the stuff is people are like the idea, they just want to see more analysis. Some of the partners we might just have to work on a little more to try and get them to understand where we're coming from. So yeah, it is a real tricky negotiation process when you've got so many partners around the table, but that's really where we're putting all our effort at the moment.
Okay, we have a question that's been asked a few times in different kind of way, and it is around the price setting. What is the appetite in Hey Waka to firm up the price setting mechanism? As Andrew says, the description in the consulting document is quite vague, so there's quite a few questions on when will there be a price.
Cam, any solutions there?
Yeah, so that's the tricky one. So, I mean, with price, part of the reason why we're doing He Waka is that we want price flexibility so that when certain things happen, we can adjust the price accordingly. So, for example, if a whole lot of technology comes along that helps us deal with our methane issue, that the price, we can reduce the price because, you know, we're already on target and we're doing a really good job. The tricky part about that is that you have price uncertainty. So it's very difficult to come in and say, right, when early 2022, 2025, the price is going to be this, because we don't know what our emissions profile is going to look like. Then we don't know what the technology is going to be. We don't know what the, we may not even know what the targets are. Targets might change before then as well. So it's really difficult. Well, yeah, the problem of building flexibility in is that uncertainty when you're so far out from the start of the scheme. And that's where, coming back to the price ceiling idea, is to say that, yes, there's going to be flexibility, but we need to have a level of certainty around what it's not going to do. And the ETS is built around this too. There is price controls in the ETS to make sure the price doesn't balloon out sooner than it really should. So that's where we're coming back to those numbers that are in the engagement document. We want that to be the worst case scenario. So that would be the highest price farmers would pay over that period, not just an absolute stab in the dark. Because I'm very worried that if we get to 2029 and we haven't quite got to where we need to for, say, the methane emissions reductions, then what's to stop the pricing committee, particularly if it's appointed by the minister at the time, from pulling the lever and saying, right, we're going to triple prices this year because we really need to make a big change in 1 year. There's absolutely nothing stopping that. And so that's the critical part of that price setting, even just for good business management. Again, the same reasons why it exists in the ETS. People need to be able to plan. They need to have some level of certainty. And that's why the pricing ceiling is so critical.
And I'd add to that, probably having some certainty around that there will be some people on that committee that are appointed by agriculture, that aren't the minister's pets, that will, speak strongly and stand their ground and not give in, is going to be vitally important to ensure that, that farmer view is, and appreciation is taken forward in this debate. And there's also people there with solid understanding of the economic impacts of what it would mean to crush down New Zealand production just to meet a target, and be able to ask the hard questions. If it's just a handpicked bunch of ministerial flukies, it would be a bit of a disaster. So we might not be able to set the price, but if we know we've got solid people there, that would possibly, in my mind, create a little bit more certainty.
We have another sort of theme of questions, frequently asked questions around a tool for data collection. Particularly, a few people have mentioned Farm IQ. We've got a comment here: as a user of Farm IQ, I have all the data already, just needs further development of APIs and some development for expediency. Yeah.
And I'd agree with that. I guess what Cam mentioned before, there is the auditing component to it. So there is the need to prove it, which I think could be, if you've got some smart systems, so computer programs are talking to one another, then it can sort of do a bit of self-validation. And I sort of always use the example of, paying tax. I've only ever been audited by the IRD once for my very first GST return. And since then, they've looked at the fact that it's, the computing programs I'm use are pretty straightforward. And they've got good certainty that things that I was trying to screw them over, it'd probably throw up some red flags within those systems. So it does come down to, if we can put some of that revenue recycling towards the systems, I think we could make that, certainly the admin side of things, a hell of a lot cheaper, a lot more clearer and easier. And also, there's the co-benefit of all the other stuff we've got to do as well, which that would be of value for.
Just to add to that too, that's a large component of the estimated admin costs for the farm level levy. It's the farmer time that Cam talked about, and it's also setting up this central system for it, the IT system, and how it's designed. And if there are those code benefits that Andrew's talking about, these APIs, these sort of data fishhooks for all your different systems, then those code benefits, that could be a good use of farmer money. And yeah, particularly if that's coupled with lower admin costs in other areas, if you end up having a unified system for all the regs that you guys are being faced with, that could be worth spending the money on in the short term. Again, it's hard to know with the lack of certainty, but that's something that we'd push for, and the document talks about having APIs for programs like FarmIQ, and that is the reason it's so expensive. But that could be well worth it for you guys.
Just leading on from that one, we've got someone asking, saying it's great to have these technological advancements and have those tools available. But what about the people without connectivity and therefore the skills to be able to complete these data entries? And has that been taken into account?
I don't know how well the poor data into the connectivity has been taken account in the work streams. What I can say is that's one of my other jobs at Feds, is the telecommunications spokesperson, and it's certainly an item I push on a regular basis with government. We're in consult. We actually had a meeting a couple of weeks back with MBIE on ways they're looking at improving that. So that's part of, our standard operating procedure at Feds, is constantly pushing for better data into connectivity. I guess in terms of the skills training, I think, I'd be surprised if most of us aren't, everyone on this is able to work out how to turn a webinar on. So that means I'm generally talking to people that are reasonably up with the play. But I feel like, most of us within our businesses, we're all going to use accounting software and a whole range of stuff. It really is just becoming part of doing business these days, of being able to do stuff online and connect. And so we've got to improve. Yeah, it's a vital thing that we've got to improve the connectivity. The Climate Change Commission themselves, in their report last year, they highlighted that fact, and it was one of the reasons we didn't, we said there was some pros with their report, because they did mention the need for improved connectivity. But Cam or Mac, has there been any sort of, at the working group or steering group level, discussion on that?
Yeah, there has, and it's just one of the many complications when it comes to reporting. What if you do, what if you're you have multiple parts of your farming operation, some with better connectivity than others? What if you've got multiple reporting systems within your farm enterprise, particularly if you look at some of the iwi enterprises or corporate enterprises running different parts all over the country with different connectivity? So yeah, there's a lot of complexity when it comes down to farm level, which is where some of the admin costs come from. And that's there again where, if we can't see us getting there in 2025, to potentially use the hybrid option as a stopgap to allow for that connectivity and that IT infrastructure to catch up, to make sure that, once it's ready to go in 2030, that it's accessible to a much wider range of farmers and much more streamlined. Because I can imagine, I'm sure all of you have worked with systems that you've just looked at and someone's run you through it and thought, shit, this isn't working for me, it's too much work, it's too hard, it's just going to turn people off. And so if we do that too early, it's just going to be too difficult to run, which adds more cost to it, because then you've got to go and audit all that as well. So yeah, I don't think we really want to jump into that level of reporting until that support structure and the internet connectivity and all that's all ready to go as well.
Leading on from what you've just said, Cam, and talking about people being prepared to put in that level of detail into the tools and everything and recording data, there's been quite a few comments and questions about seeing other farmers feeling like they should start with the hybrid level option and then moving to an adapted version of the farm level levy. And this question is just, is that an option Feds would support?
So I guess we'll support what our members give us the feedback through. Certainly in the meetings, there has been that we've held a preference for everything at the farm level. I guess it makes, to a degree, it makes sense that, okay, let's, as Cam mentioned, let's start there and move to this point. The concerns I've got would be you often get inertia and things get stuck and bureaucracies build around certain structures, and there's always an excuse why something can't happen. It's kind of like every time I drive past Transmission Gully recently, it's there's only a little plastic barrier stopping me from driving on the bloody thing. It's ready to go, although I see they've just gone and ripped it up the other day. But you know, that would be my worry, that like we've got with GWP 100, it was put in as a stopgap measure something like 30 years ago, and we're still stuck with it. And that at the time it was like, we know this doesn't work for methane, but we'll come up with something better in time and we'll replace it. And no, it didn't happen. So that would be my primary concern with that. Also, there are concerns around it doesn't. There are aspects to it where the modelling, and take it with a grain of salt, shows that it would reduce production more than the other options. I'm not quite sure why. And so, yeah, you'd have a bit more emissions leakage with it. But it does come down to how well, I guess, that level of certainty you'd all have around, will it actually evolve, or could we just get stuck there?
And I think that's potentially, well, probably one of the wins we had late last year, because we've had that concern for a while, that we spend all this money and time building a hybrid system and then have a criteria of when we might switch to farm level. But as Andrew says, that gets pushed out, and then we've invested so much money in a hybrid system that no one wants to go and put money into a new system after that. And so that was brought up at one of the steering group meetings late last year around actually putting a date on when that transition would be, or at least a rough timeline, which we've kind of come to about early 2030 if we were to head down that path. And then to build the interim solution, call it hybrid or whatever it might be, would be built with that end in mind. So that's any investment you put into a hybrid needs to be able to transition into a farm level system at some point, so that the farm level is actually the end goal. The hybrid is just the design to kind of get us there. It's the interim solution. So that'll be a different mindset to try and combat what Andrew's talking about, is that we go and build a complete system in the hybrid and then no one really has the appetite to change to what we actually need long term. So look, the appetite around the steering group is probably at this stage, in full honesty, around going from hybrid to farm level. But yeah, we as Andrew says, yeah, very keen to hear what you guys think, because we will support whatever the members think.
I'm going to try and merge two questions into one now. So this question is, why are only natives important in this conversation? Are non-native trees or other vegetation, someone else has mentioned grass, not useful in the emissions debate?
I could probably tackle that one. So yeah, the natives, I guess the native only category applies to ETS eligible. So that decision was made by the sequestration working group and then brought forward to other groups to recognise both how difficult it is to recognise natives in the ETS right now, and how low that uptake rate is, and the broader benefits of native trees, the water quality, biodiversity, etc. And then so exotic trees can still be counted, but once they hit that 1 hectare, 30 metres, 5 metres tall, 30% canopy cover threshold, they no longer qualify for this, and then but they can be recognised under the ETS. And that also addresses the concerns we've seen with the blanket afforestation of particularly sheep and beef farms. There's a broad suite of government policies that are tilting the table towards afforestation relative to other land uses, and we didn't want to add to that. Yeah, in regards to having that overlap between natives and the ETS, I think we're erring towards that probably not being the best idea for spending farmer money when you're talking about spending $100 million in it. I personally don't think that's the best system. If there are other ways of recognising that through the ETS, I think the Waka Eke Noa system should be focused on recognising sequestration that can't otherwise be recognised. But natives can, exotics, so pines and macrocarpus and whatnot, can certainly be counted, but it's just not for that one category. So I think they have to be mostly planted after 2008, and they have to, the cyclical and then the permanent category, they have to tick those quite prescriptive boxes. In regards to grass, there's sort of two forms to this question. That the actual grass above the ground, that just doesn't make sense, because if you treat grass like you treat trees, then you get credit as the grass grows. But as soon as you either cut that grass for hay, or there's a drought and the grass dies, or the cow eats the grass, you have to pay a liability back, and then you'd have to get credit when it grows again. And that's how it works for forestry, and it'd be an absolute nightmare when you're dealing with not a lot of carbon at all. But for below the grass, the what's the term? There's a term for it, which I've forgotten. There'll be a soil scientist on the call now, screaming at his mic. For the root structures and the carbon that's stored below the ground from grass, we also refer to this as soil carbon. There was a report commissioned by Waka Eke Noa. I think that was by two ag research or CRI scientists that are really switched on in this area, looking into it. You could do it in two broad ways. You could say, here are the management practices, such as going from ploughing fields to no-till cropping that are good. We'll incentivize them, a bit like the actions approach Cam talked about. Or we could say, let's actually measure it. Let's put do field management once every however, or we could put some probes or whatnot in soil. As it stands now, the recommendation was to keep looking into this, to keep trying to recognise it, but the science just isn't there to do it at a level that the partnership would be confident in. It's certainly something we're interested in the Feds and a longer time scale. It can work for some farms, but at a national level, if you're dealing with areas such as the Waikato that are historically drained peatlands, you're also losing a lot of soil carbon every year, pretty much no matter what you do, apart from turning your farm into a wetland. So it's an area we're looking at, but it's got its benefits and risks, and that's something that we have to weigh up. It could be good for the individual farm, but perhaps not for the industry, particularly when you look at the what I was talking a bit before about the additionality principle that we're applying here. So like I'm from Australia, it works out great for Australian farmers, where over the summer you could fit your fist into the crack into the ground and there's zero carbon, soil carbon, everything's dead, and then we'll pay you to go from 0% to 1% soil carbon. It's a lot of money. Whereas New Zealand, the soils, they tend to be have cover all year round, much nicer climate. Some would say nicer people too, but not me, right? And that you're starting from a higher base. So of course you only need a few things to go wrong, and then you've got a big liability on your hands. Very complicated debate, that one, but that's about as much as I can cover it here.
Okay, we've got, with the potential error in the estimation of methane emissions associated with a kilo of beef being plus or minus almost 50%, how can any rational approach include having to assess the quality of hay or baleage in the farm level model?
So that's our challenge. It comes back to cost versus accuracy. So we can use broad level averages. So I actually can't remember the number per kg of milk solid. I think it's about 9.2 or something nationally. Mick, you might know that, but yeah, and there'll be a huge plus and minus on that, because there's a huge variety of farms out there as to how efficiently that kilo of milk or kilo of beef is being produced. So to get that absolutely accurate, and if you take beef for an example, if you wanted to get absolutely accurate on that number, you'd have to do what I was saying before. You would need to be weighing every bit of feed, everything you cut off your farm. You'd have to be measuring the quality of it. You'd have to be working out exactly when you fed it, what the weather conditions were. You'd have to be weighing your animals very regularly, like 100% accurate. You need to be weighing them every day, but probably weighing them at least once a month, all your animals on the property. So it comes down to how accurate do we want to be versus the cost of doing it. So if you're spending 20 grand a year on doing your reporting, but your bill's actually only going to be 11 grand for your emissions, well, it's kind of pointless, because you're spending more on reporting it than you are paying. And I think every farmer gets pretty pissed off when that's the case. So that's the debate. That's our challenge, is that we can't be 100% accurate. We will never be 100% accurate, but we want to be efficiently accurate, I guess, is perhaps the best way to put it, that we're putting effort in, that we get rewarded for the actions or the type of system that we're running, and that ultimately we're reducing emissions in line with whatever the targets happen to be, but that we're not spending so much time and so much money on it that really the whole system is just a complete waste of effort. And it's a tough one. It's a continuum. Everyone's probably going to have a different opinion on that. It's going to be easier for some farm systems than others, and that's what we're wrestling with at the moment.
Just to add to that too, like Cam's exactly right. It's a continuum with accuracy, and we're dealing with biological systems here, and that makes it innately complicated, very complex. And to be blunt, there's a reason no other country is trying to price these emissions, right? Is that they are biological systems, and we're trying to fit them into a system that currently operates on a kilo of coal into a furnace, or a kilometre driven by a combustible engine, which is a lot more predictable than the rate of burps by a cow. And that's a reality of this. That's the government's decision. If I had my way and the feds had their way, we wouldn't be going down this road, but we are. And that 50% plus or minus, I think it's about 30% for nitrous oxide as well. You can get that lower, but you're not going to get that to zero. And even with Overseer and some of the more demanding tools, there is that level of inaccuracy that doesn't exist for other pricing regimes, and that it's just going to be, it is what it is, which isn't a great answer, but that's the reality of it. That was broadly okay when we, like Andrew said, have 100, or Cam said, 100% free allocation. So it's just for reporting. I'm sick of hearing about 48% of emissions coming from agriculture when we know that's not right for various reasons, but that's okay. But when you're handing farmers a bill and some of these numbers we're talking about, that's going to be the viability of businesses. That is there should be a higher demand, but we don't want to, high demand for accuracy, but we, like Cam says, we don't want to set up, this whole scheme has to be revenue neutral. Government's not chipping in any extra money into it. So we don't want to spend all day trying to work it out. So yeah, I think from the get-go, we're trying to force a bit of a round hole into a square peg, and cows aren't as predictable as lorries of coal, but that's the world, that's the hand we've been dealt thus far.
Okay, we've got here, since ETS New Zealand has to fit in with the emissions reduction plan globally, do we know if the emissions reduction plan global will recognise the difference between long and short-lived gases?
So this is what we asked James Shaw to push last year at COP26. We ourselves, Dairy NZ, Beef and Lamb, wrote a letter. We actually, in person, we discussed it, can you push this split gas approach? And basically the attitude was that all the countries in Europe would be against and laugh at him because they feel like we're not doing enough already. My rebuttal was, ignore Europe, go talk to South America, go talk to Asia, other countries that have got similar like profiles to us with heavy reliance on primary industries, build up support that way. But no, James would rather play with the boys in Europe.
Yeah,
so, short answer.
Just to add that too, Andrew, like that international targets, there's a bit of a different interpretations of that, but it's in the name. They're NDCs, nationally determined contribution. We can set them to be whatever we want, and as long as we stand out there and say, here's why we're doing it, that's totally fine. We did that with our domestic targets, a split gas target, and if it's good enough for that, then it should be good enough internationally. And like Andrew said, that's just a lack of political leadership, to be blunt, and we need to make that case as to why it's the right thing to do. There was a paper out, I think yesterday, on using the split gas approach internationally. Beef and Lamb did a write-up about it. So I think that with time, and even in the 3 years I've been at Feds, there is growing consensus. It was in the last IPCC report, but we just need to just show that political leadership and make that case. At COP26, New Zealand's plan to reduce emissions is to buy $1 billion of international credits, which will has a risk of creating the problems we're seeing in New Zealand from afforestation, but just in poorer countries. So, we won a fossil of the day award, or fossil of the in that for our appearance at the Climate Change Commission. So I think not taking leadership positions in some of these key issues in an attempt to try and show off to the trendy European countries, it's not working out what we're doing now. So we might as well make the case for some proper science. And the reason New Zealand needs to do this than other countries is because we've got so much renewable electricity and so many livestock proportionally. Other countries don't have that. But as other countries start to both, reduce their reliance on coal and natural gas and maintain farming industries proportionally, they'll be having the same problem we're doing. And it may just take another country to show leadership and to take a split gas approach for then New Zealand to follow in their wake. But yeah, certainly Feds and Dairy and Z and Beef and Lamb have been making that case, along with processors, decans and MIA. And you know, we've just been making that case consistently for years now, and it's just going to take, like it did with the split gas targets domestically, to the government's credit, just follow through for that. And we want to see that through a lot of areas. Emissions budgets would be a big one. Reporting life cycle assessments. The Climate Change Commission did it, say long live and short live, get rid of that 48%, follow through with the start that was taken with the split gas approach. And that's just political will. There's no international rule book. There's no UN police that are going to come and knock on our doors if we don't do it.
Okay, I think we will call it there as it's 1:30. Just a big thank you for everyone that's joined us and asked questions. We really appreciate the questions, and if we didn't get to yours, that will get sent through to us and we'll do our best to answer them as soon as we can. There has been a recording of this webinar, so we'll get that out as soon as we can as well. And there is also a second webinar which will have the exact same content, just another opportunity to ask questions on Tuesday the 15th. So if you know anyone else that has missed this one, or you just want to listen in again, come along to that. And again, look out for that survey on Tuesday the 15th in your email inboxes. It's not just another email from Feds. It's really important we get your feedback. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to our speakers.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Very well facilitated, Lauren, too.
Thank you very much, Macauley.
See you guys.